Good morning, guys. How are you guys doing today? Love it. Me too. Doing great. You know, it's easy, I forget pretty easily that I have things so good. And I slept in a nice, safe place last night. I had dinner last night and breakfast this morning. I have a car that I got to drive to campus. I walked across the safe campus to this beautiful building. And today we get to be in this room to discuss risk and insurance. And you guys have got these wonderful futures ahead of you in this brilliant country with this economy that we have. And I easily forget that. Sometimes I think when I wake up in the morning, I forget to know that, man, this is a great day. We are really, really fortunate to be here. I forget my roots. I don't know if you guys ever have that, but I forget my roots sometimes. That it doesn't work like that everywhere, I know. Where I come from in South Africa, we have 40% unemployment rate. The city that I grew up in, Johannesburg, is the crime capital of the world. You don't drive to places without looking over your shoulder, wondering whether you're going to be hijacked or someone's going to steal your car. You don't just walk across a college campus without there being security guards with AK-47s that are keeping you safe while you're walking across that campus. And when you're sitting in that classroom, you don't know whether when you finish your degree, there's actually going to be a job for you in an economy that's not quite as robust as our economy that we have here. For many of the students that I taught, they didn't know whether there was going to be food on their table that night, and many of them hadn't had breakfast that morning because they were first-generation college students who had never had an opportunity before and who didn't have money and were living in shacks. And it's easy for me to forget that. And I think it's easy for all of us to forget that sometimes and just to come into the classroom and think, well, you know, okay, I was born here, this is my life, and I deserve what I've got here. Sometimes I forget that. So it's nice to have a little bit of context at times in our day to know, man, I'm really lucky, blessed to be in this place now, and I'm going to be intentional in this next 50 minutes that I've got to make the most of what I get from this lecture so that it can lead to my personal success and the success of those around me. So today, we're going to start our discussion of risk and insurance right at the beginning. It's a good place to start. So we'll start talking about chapter 1 of your textbook. We discussed the textbook on Monday in our previous lecture, and you've either got a copy of it or you've got access to it. We're going to be using Echo 360. The syllabus has instructions there on how to get onto Echo 360, and I'd sent you an email about that before as well. So I'm assuming that all of you are set up for Echo 360 and that you'll be able to respond to the quizzes that we have here today. I do realize, though, that some of you may not have been listening entirely when we last spoke and may not have read my email with as much attention as I might have liked. So there is grace. I'm going to give you until the end of the day to do the quizzes that we're going to have in class, the little polls that we have in class, in case you don't have that technology set up for today. But this is the only chance that you get to do it at the end of the day. From this point on, we all need to be on the same page and make sure that we can get things done in the classroom. Any questions? All right, crystal clear. Great, so we're going to start talking about risk and its treatment. This is the first chapter of your text. Our agenda for our next 45 minutes that we have is thinking about some definitions of risk. We know that risk is this really big concept, and in order for us to have a discussion this semester about risk, we're going to need to define it in different contexts and build a vocabulary around risk. So that's what's going to be coming in this first part here, is talking about different kinds of risk and defining risk. thinking about chance of loss, peril, and hazard. And then, this we won't do today, but we'll do this later, thinking about personal and commercial risks. And then ultimately in this chapter, having a look at a preview of what the burden of risk is. And I think this is an important point in the textbook to have this, because if it turns out that risk has absolutely no burden on society, that risk doesn't impose any burden on society, well, then there's no point for us to even go further and think about, should we manage this? Should we allocate resources, whether it's time or money, to managing this thing if it has no burden, if it imposes no burden, if it has no cost on society, on individuals and businesses and government entities. So that's where we're going. Pardon. Your textbook defines risk as uncertainty concerning the occurrence of a loss. So I went to the doctor yesterday. I've got laryngitis. So this is probably going to continue for a few more days. So what do we mean by uncertainty? Well, the word is the man, there's different versions of this voice. The word is the key there, that it's the lack of certainty. So uncertainty is where we don't have certainty. If we've got a company, that's better, and the CFO of the company knows that they're going to be sued because of a product defect, and a court is going to award $10 million against them because somebody's been injured by their product. It's called a product liability exposure. The CFO knows this for certain. Is there any risk? No, there's no uncertainty whatsoever. That CFO's job then is to finance that outflow, to come up with some capital to cover that outflow. There's no uncertainty there. There is certainty. So uncertainty is where we don't know whether a loss is going to happen or not, or we don't know what the extent of that loss is going to be. So there's two ways that I want to illustrate this for you. And on this slide over here, I've got two pictures that are close to my heart. The first picture at the bottom here is of a safari treehouse in a game reserve called Madikwe Game Reserve in the northern parts of South Africa. I'm South African, so that's why that's close to my heart. So there's this safari treehouse. And this would, I think, be an example of what we now call glamping. Right? It looks pretty fancy to me. There's some curtains and some white furniture in there, and it looks pretty fancy. And the picture on the right there is from my wife's country, from Chile, and that is in Santiago, Chile, and that's the Costanera Tower. That's the tallest tower in South America. Tallest building in South America, the Costanera Tower. So, what I want you to think about is, given what I've told you about risk so far, and about uncertainty, what's riskier? Falling off the top of the Costanera Tower in Chile, or falling out of the safari treehouse in South Africa? Which of those is riskier? Is this poll open for you? It is open? Okay. Which is riskier? Falling off the top of Costanera Tower? Thank you. There we go. Or out of the safari treehouse. At the moment, it looks like Costanera Tower is winning. as you're answering this, of course, I know that you're going to be thinking about what does this idea of risk mean, as we spoke about on the previous slide regarding uncertainty. And I'll leave this open for a bit before we finish talking about this, so that you guys can get yourselves situated with the software. And I'm going to leave this poll open until the end of today, for those of you that haven't set yourselves up yet, so that you can do that by the end of today and still earn participation points for participating in this poll. As I mentioned, though, this is the only time that I'll do this. Starting on Friday, then the only way to earn participation points will be to be here in class and with Echo 360 ready to go. So looking at this, we've got a lot of people, we've got 20 of you so far that have voted for falling off the top of the Costanera Tower in Chile as being the riskiest, being associated with the greatest amount of uncertainty. And 7 of you have that with falling out of that safari treehouse in South Africa. So, let me illustrate for you which one of these is correct. If I can do that, I think I have to stop the poll probably to do that. Who said falling off the top of the Costanera Tower in Chile? Who wants to be our representative there?
How tall is the treehouse?
It's, let me see if I can go back here. It's right there. That's that safari treehouse.
So like 8 feet.
So there's a tree there. I'm going to guess it's about, 8 to 10 feet off the ground. I should have told you, this is in the Madikwe Game Reserve. So in our game reserves in Africa, in South Africa and throughout Africa, we have obviously amazing game animals. So there are lions, cheetahs, leopards, elephants, antelope, hyenas, wild dogs. They have a lot of wild dogs in Madikwe. It's one of the things they're known for. So all of those animals are there. The predators are hungry. So let's think about this. Who chose the safari treehouse in South Africa? Who wants to tell us why? You want to go ahead? Tell me.
I chose it because you're pretty certain if I fell off that tower, you'd probably die. But with the other one, you might live, and then you got to worry about animals and all that nonsense.
What is your name?
Chris.
Chris. That's excellent, Chris. Yeah, I like that, Chris. So, if you fall off the top of the Costanera Tower there in Chile, there's only one outcome. You're dead. That's the only thing that's happening there. If you fall out of that tree house in Africa, there's a couple of things or several things that could happen. It could be that you fall out and you land on a little bush, and you don't injure yourself, you stand up, you walk up and you get back in your tree house and everything's good. Or alternatively, it could be that you fall out and you break a leg and you're lying there, not able to move, and the predator comes and they're hungry. And that doesn't turn out very well for you. So there we've got uncertainty because there's different potential outcomes. With the Costanera Tower, there is only one outcome. So there is complete certainty in that example. So when we're thinking about risk, we really want to make sure that we focus on uncertainty, variation, variability. And we're going to capture this in a number of different ways as we speak about this concept. So the traditional definition, as we've mentioned then, is that we've got this uncertainty about whether a loss is going to occur or not, and how much it might cost. Within the insurance industry, we use risk as a noun as well. So we'd use risk to identify a property or a life that is to be insured. So as an example, that Costanera Tower, that tower is insured. It's insured by a range of different insurance companies. Typically not just one insurance company would want to insure something that big and expensive. So the risk is split between several. If we think about the Twin Towers in the US, the Twin Towers were insured by more than 10 different insurance and reinsurance companies that participated in that insurance program. So you have many different insurance companies. And the way in which this insurance works, let's think back to the Twin Towers, is that there's a broker, an intermediary, that represents the business owner. So on the Twin Towers, Larry Silverstein had a 99-year lease on the Twin Towers, and he wanted them obviously to be insured. Larry Silverstein had a broker that he was working with, Willis, now known as Willis Towers Watson. It's one of the biggest brokers in the world. And Willis Towers Watson, then what the broker's job is to then identify risks associated with the property, and then to find ways to finance those risks and to mitigate those risks. And one way of financing risks, of course, is insurance. So for a fair bit of the risks facing the Twin Towers, there was an insurance program that broker had set up. So that broker then would go to an underwriter, someone at an insurance company, and say, here is a risk I'd like you to look at. And they'd give them a proposal that would have all the details about the Twin Towers. In that context, the Twin Towers then would be a risk. It would be the subject of insurance. That underwriter would then review that risk and assess whether or not they wanted to insure it, and if they did, at what price they would want to insure that risk. So risk is also used to identify then the property that's being considered for insurance. In this case, it's the Twin Towers. Or in life insurance, it would be the individual that's being considered for insurance. What we're wanting to cover here is potential loss exposures. And your textbook defines a loss exposure then as a situational circumstance in which loss is possible, regardless of whether it actually occurs. So this is just where we're exposed to loss. So thinking again about insurance, firms buy insurance for a range of things, for lawsuits in case their product injures somebody, for lawsuits because in case one of their executives assaults employees, for lawsuits in case they don't follow proper practices in hiring or firing, for injuries of their employees, for injuries of other people, all kinds of things, regardless of whether this has actually already happened. That's not why they buy insurance. They buy insurance for loss exposures, that they're exposed to potential losses of cyber threats, of their networks being hacked. So that's the loss exposure, regardless of whether it actually occurs. And now we're going to spend a fair bit of time distinguishing between two types of risk: subjective risk and objective risk. And these words themselves, if the word objective typically means that it's something that we have a fair bit of knowledge about, there's not a lot of bias that's involved. If I'm being objective about something, I'm trying not to introduce my personal bias. I'm trying to be somewhat scientific about it. So in general, when we think about objective risk, it's risk it's measurable, it's observable, and a way in which we can capture this is by comparing actual loss to expected loss. And to the extent that these things differ, what we actually expect losses to be and what the losses actually are and what we expect them to be, there would be objective risk. Another type of risk is based on perception, based on an individual's state of mind, their mental condition. It's not data-driven. My family and I fly a bunch because we're all spread out all over the world. My sister is in London, I'm here in the United States, my wife's family is in Chile, I've got friends all over, so we fly a lot. And whenever I'm on an airplane, I meet people who are scared to death of being on an airplane. They're about to take off and they're gripping the sides so hard, and you can just tell how nervous and scared they are to fly. That's an example of subjective or perceived risk. I could tell them, it wouldn't be very kind of me or helpful, I could explain to them that objectively the risk of dying in an airplane accident is lower than the risk of dying walking across a road as a pedestrian. That's what statistics tell us. Is that objectively I've got a higher chance of dying being hit by a car as I walk across the road than I do of dying in an airplane accident. That's not going to be very helpful to that person at that point. It's not going to be very kind for me to do that at that point. But that's the difference between subjective risk, which is based on my perceptions, not data-driven, and objective risk, which implicitly here, your textbook doesn't use these words, but implicitly here, it's data-driven, because we're comparing actual loss to expected loss. And we'll do a little example of this in a bit. Chance of loss, this is the probability that something that causes a loss is going to occur. Suppose that there's a company that manufactures something and they have a bunch of delivery vehicles that they use for their deliveries. And last year, 20 of their delivery vehicles were stolen. They have a total of 100 delivery vehicles. And 20 of those 100 vehicles were stolen last year. Based on these historical data alone, what would we say the chance of loss from theft is? 20%, right? 20 out of 100. 20%. That's what we say the chance of loss is. It would be 20%, the probability of loss. Suppose that you're an executive with that firm and you see these numbers. How do you feel about that? Is that a good number? Seems terribly high, doesn't it? 1 in every 5 vehicles being stolen. If you were the risk manager, you'd probably say, we need to figure out a way either to reduce this incidence of theft or otherwise to avoid it. So to reduce it, you might say, well, maybe we need to use some loss control measures. Maybe there's anti-theft devices that we need to use. Perhaps we're not training our employees correctly. Perhaps we're using the wrong route when we're driving to certain places. Maybe by doing all of these things we can cut down on theft risk. Fortunately, from where many of us come from, or many of you guys come from in the US, theft risk isn't that bad, right? We have, videos don't work well in this platform that I'm using at the moment, but we have these crazy videos in South Africa, you could Google them at some point if you wanted to, of things that people use against hijackers, because we have a problem in Johannesburg with hijackers. If people come to your car and they put a gun there and they take your car. So somebody invented these things where it goes under your car and it shoots out fire. It's like blow torches under your car. You hit a button and the flames come out, and that protects you from being hijacked. I don't know that really took off very well, because can you imagine that you accidentally hit that button? That wouldn't work out very, very well at all. So that's one way that you might deal with it. But then what you might also say is, we can't reduce this risk sufficiently. Maybe we need to avoid it. How might we avoid this theft risk? Well, as I said, you manufacture products and then you've got this fleet of delivery vehicles. Maybe you should subcontract delivery. Maybe rather what we should be doing is using FedEx or somebody else and having them deliver the goods rather than us delivering the goods. These are topics we'll get to later in the class where we start thinking about core competencies of firms, what their comparative advantage is. Most likely a firm that manufactures something, their comparative advantage isn't in delivery. It's probably in making that stuff. And they can subcontract the distribution of their product to somebody that specializes in distributing products. So this might be an example of where we might want to avoid risk. So the chance is the probability that an event that causes loss occurs. Objective risk is, I like this definition your textbook uses here. They use it really early, but I'm hoping you're going to see what they want you to think about. They use this term where they say it's the relative variation of actual loss from expected loss. That's what they mean by objective risk. So suppose, let me switch to this document camera here for a second. Suppose that you've got these vehicles that were stolen last year. Suppose that the total value of those vehicles was $10 million. So that's the value of the vehicles that we lost last year. Our theft loss was $10 million. Does that tell us anything about risk? Nothing. It's just a number, $10 million. What if I told you that we then went and we looked at data, and we looked at the last 10 years of data. So let's take this as year number 10. Looked at the last 10 years of data, and when we took the average across all 10 years, we saw that the average was $10 million. The average is $10 million. Does this tell you anything about risk yet? No, you're shaking your head? Still not? Why not?
We have no idea what the risk associated with these numbers are.
Okay, good. So you need more information from me. Great. So, what if we know that the data looks something like this? Is that helpful so far? Just ignore the bottom numbers. I'm not going to make them all up. But is this giving you a sense of uncertainty or of risk? Is that what you were looking for?
I mean, kind of.
There's no consistency.
Yeah, there's not really it's changing from year to year.
Change from year to year. Let me give you two scenarios. What is your name?
Kyle?
Kyle. Okay, I'm going to work with you on this, Kyle. Going to give you two scenarios, A and B. A looks just like that. B, on the other hand, looks like this. And B also has an average of $10 million. Which of these has greater objective risk, A or B?
Okay.
Why, Kyle?
Because you're more uncertain from year to year.
Beautiful. Beautiful. A, because there's greater uncertainty. Now, Kyle might want to capture that uncertainty. If you were to capture the uncertainty, Kyle, is there some statistical method that you might want to try and capture this uncertainty? that you can think about. And if you're like me when I was an undergraduate, after I took statistics, I tried to forget it as quickly as possible because the class was all about, there's a bucket of different balls. There's a yellow ball and a blue one and a green one. And if you pull a green one first, what's the probability of pulling a yellow one next? So I just try to forget about it. Those of you that haven't forgotten about this yet, or put it out of your minds, is there anything that this is ringing a bell? Something that we might want to calculate that's going to tell us about objective risk? Yes, what is your name? Toby. Variance. Lovely. Toby says, I'm going to just do it on the side here if you can see it. Toby says variance. And variance's little brother is called standard deviation, right? That's the square root of variance. So Toby says, hey, there's a way that we can measure this uncertainty that Kyle was talking about. What we can do is we can say, let's compare our actual losses, let's call that xi, our actual losses, let's compare that to our expected or average losses, x bar. You're going to square those things, we're going to add them all up. We're going to divide by the number of things that there are. And that's going to give us our variance. And for risk B over here, actual loss minus expected loss means that we're going to be saying $10 million minus $10 million is equal to 0. Plus $10 million minus $10 million is equal to 0. We're going to get 0 objective risk for risk B because there's no variation between actual and expected. However, for risk A, we're going to be saying 10 minus 10 is 0, but 30 minus 10 is 20. We square that, we now get 400. And so we go on. And that's actually going to give us some objective risk there. So at this point, it's okay if you've looked at this and you've said, man, I don't remember all that much about variance or anything like that. That's fine. We're going to get there. The big important thing at the moment is that you understand this concept of the difference in certainty versus uncertainty. And we can express this in another way. We can say that we have a graph where this is the dollar amount of losses, this is years, so time, and for one of these, it looks like this, whereas for the other, it looks like that, right? A is uncertain, it varies from year to year, whereas B, the losses were identical in each year. Looking at this over here, we can see that uncertainty. Important point though, important takeaway here for us, is that in both of these examples, in both A and B, the expected loss is exactly the same. So an important takeaway for us here is that averages tell us nothing about uncertainty. We know that by now. Averages tell us nothing about risk. It's variation around what we expect. It's variation around those averages. That's what tells us about riskiness. You guys good? Any questions? Lovely. Lovely that it's clear, not lovely that you don't have questions. I want as many questions as you possibly have. So in the same sense, the chance of loss might be identical, but the objective risk might be different. So here's an example. You've got two professors for the same course. Each of these professors has 100 students in each class, and they tend to average 10 F grades over the past 5 years. So that's the average number of Fs that they award, is 10 over the past 5 years. Professor 1 awards exactly 10 per year. Professor 2 awards a different amount each year. You're a prospective student, and you want to think about which of these profs has the greater average chance of loss, and also which has the greater objective risk. So here's a quiz for you then. Which prof's class, is this open, the quiz? Great. Which prof's class has higher objective risk, meaning of making an F? Is this Prof F, Prof 1, or Prof 2? You can see I pulled out all the really tough questions for the first day. Okay. So I think someone hit the A button by accident here. So this is Prof 2, right? Prof 2 has the higher objective risk because there's variation in there. 5, 15, 0, 10, 20. There's variation. They have the identical average number of Fs, which is 10, but Prof 2 has the higher objective risk there. We've already thought about this idea of subjective risk or perceived risk. I expressed it to you in terms of being a passenger on an airplane as opposed to an auto accident. Since it's a Wednesday morning, we don't have to think too much about negative things, but in the slides that I have on Blackboard, in this you're not able to access this link, but certainly in the Blackboard slides you're able to access the link that gives you a sense of lifetime odds of death from these various causes. And I think you'll see exactly what we spoke about earlier, that at times what we perceive to have the highest risk doesn't actually have that at the end of the day. So your textbook moves on at this point to now think about, okay, when we're discussing these losses, what is the cause of loss? And given that these losses don't happen in a vacuum, what factors are there that influence whether or not a loss is going to happen and how bad it is once it happens? And the terms that your textbook uses for these two things are peril and hazard. Where a peril is the cause of the loss, so this would be a fire, flood, theft, etc., cyber attack, lawsuit, these would all be perils. And a hazard then is a condition that increases the loss. It can increase the probability of the loss, the chance of the loss, and it can also increase the size of the loss. So thinking first about physical hazards, this is a condition that increases frequency and severity of loss. And I'm going to skip to the next slide to illustrate this. There's two pictures here. One is meaningful to me, the other one isn't. Your top left there is the Atacama Desert. So that's the driest desert, my wife tells me, in the world. And that's in northern Chile. And the picture below that is just a generic random Shell station. So think about fire. Fire is this peril. The outcome of that peril differs dramatically based on location. A fire in the Atacama Desert is going to have absolutely no influence. However, a fire at this gas station, well, that's going to be a big deal because of the physical hazard, because of the gasoline that is at that gas station. That's going to make a big deal there. It will increase the severity of that loss substantially. Okay, that's very simple so far. So what does this mean? What we'll see this means is that when we're thinking about managing risk later in this semester, we'd want to identify the perils that we can, but then in addition to that, we'd want to identify the hazards and want to make sure that there's a way that we can separate or draw some distance, either physical distance or other kind of distance between the peril and the hazard to reduce the outcome of losses. Moral hazard, of course, is dishonesty or character defects that increase the frequency and severity of losses. Insurance, because it's offering financial rewards, financial payments as a result of a loss, insurance is often associated with moral hazard, where individuals bring about losses, fake injuries, so that they can collect on policies. It's not that they're always fake injuries. If you were to Google Nub City, I don't put it in my slides because I find it's just not very tasteful. But you can Google Nub City, N-U-B City, and you'll find that there's articles that are written about a town in Florida a few decades ago that is now being called Nub City, where the residents of this city realized that there's personal accident insurance that will pay certain amounts of money for each appendage that you lose. So if you lose a finger, it'll pay X amount. If you lose a hand, it'll pay X amount. If you lose a foot, it'll pay X amount. And the citizens of this city actually did that. So for some reason, it became this group thing. You've got to Google this and look at it. There's articles, I think it was in Time, that they had an article about this, or in Newsweek, Nub City. The writer of these articles spoke about how he'd walked through the city, and there were just people who were like missing hands and feet, so that they could collect from the insurance proceeds. What is the name? Anyone who's looked this up so far while we're going here? What is the name of the town? Vernon, Florida. Isn't that nuts? And they would come up with all kinds of creative ways to do it. So a guy was driving a truck, and he had a shotgun next to him in the truck, and it was strategically pointed at his foot, and then he shot his foot off so that he could collect on the insurance policy. It was just nuts. So this is clearly moral hazard, right? Individuals who are bringing about loss to collect on policies. Most people, sorry to I apologize to the citizens of Vernon, Florida. Most people are smarter than me. Most people, when they try and commit insurance fraud, they do it in a way that is not observable. So in a type of insurance where it attracts a lot of moral hazard, which is called workers' compensation insurance, it covers worker injuries. There what usually happens is workers will fake an injury that's typically difficult to diagnose. If you're smart, that's what you would pick, right? It's like a neck or a back injury. You don't need to go and cut off your finger. That's not necessary. If you want to fake an injury, fake something that's a deep tissue injury, a neck or a back injury, and that's what we tend to see, right, when we're looking at insurance fraud. When I got to the United States in 2000, I studied at the University of Georgia, and I bought a car and decided I want to assimilate as quickly as possible into American culture. So I said I'm going to buy an American car. And I bought an Oldsmobile Cutlass, 92. I don't know if there's many of these around still, but it had a big bench seat in the front. It was a boat. Loved that car. So one day I'm driving on Atlanta Highway if you like the B-52s, that's what you're thinking about right now. I'm driving down Atlanta Highway on the way to college, and I stop at a traffic light, and I see the cars next to me moving forward. So that's what I do, I move forward, but of course the car in front of me hadn't moved forward. So I ding the car in front of me. And the lady gets out of her car, I get out of my car, we look, and her bumper is damaged. There's not a scratch on my boat. And she says, look, let's pull to the side of the road, call the police, so we do that. The police come, talk to the policeman, and I say, okay, are we free to go? He says, well, we're just waiting for the ambulance. I said, what do you mean? He says, no, that lady can't get out of the car. She hurt her neck. I said, wait a minute, we just got out the car minutes ago. She said, no, she says she can't get out the car. So the ambulance comes, and they put her on a stretcher. I say to the guys in the ambulance that are carrying the stretcher, I say to them, what? The stretcher? I said, no, well, for liability purposes, we can't just lift someone out of the car. We've got to stabilize them and immobilize them. So they go off. Not long after this, I get a letter of demand from a law firm for $300,000. Right? Man, I just got here from South Africa. I sold all my stuff. I got my golf clubs and some clothes and a beautiful car. I don't have $300,000. So let me just close up here. So my insurance company gets hold of me and they say, look, we've decided that we're going to settle this case. We're not going to litigate it. Turns out that there was prior injuries to this person, and it was very difficult to detect how much this accident had worsened their deep tissue injury that they had. All right. My insurance policy had a limit of $100,000 for that damage. Pardon. How much do you think that lady got from the insurance policy? $100,000. So that was my introduction to moral hazard. That's dishonesty or character defect in that individual. Insurance in general, though, is more associated. We've still got 3 minutes, at least 2 minutes. You've paid for them. Insurance is more associated with what we call attitudinal hazard. Insurance provides us with a safety net. And whenever there's a safety net, we act differently. If you've ever watched trapeze artists, I like to go to a place in Mexico called Club Med with my family, and they have trapeze for grown-ups and kids. So we're all doing trapeze. If there wasn't a safety net, there's no chance I would even climb up the ladder, never mind try and do trapeze. But because there's a safety net, I did something risky. Because we're insured, because we have a safety net of an insurance policy, we behave differently than what we would otherwise. As a result, insurance companies realize that they've got to manage this attitudinal hazard. How do you think they do that? This will be our last thought for today, how do they manage that because my car is insured, I might park it somewhere dodgy, in a dodgy neighborhood, because if it's stolen, doesn't matter, it's insured. Or because my house is insured, I might not care as much about whether I lock my doors, because after all the stuff in my house, it's insured. What stops me from thinking exactly like that? I love it. What's your name? James. Deductibles. The insurance company says, I know how we'll stop that. We'll have you have some skin in the game. Deductibles. You might think, who cares? The insurance company will pay for it. But wait a minute, you have to pay the first X amount. You have to pay the first $1,000 for your auto deductible if your car is, if you cause an accident or you're in an accident. If you lose your cell phone and you bought the insurance on it, they're not just going to give you a brand new cell phone and say, okay, you're fine. No, you're going to have to pay for some of that amount yourself. That's called a deductible. That's how insurance companies deal with attitudinal hazard. When we see each other on Friday, we'll talk about legal hazard. And hopefully I'll sound better.